Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast. My name is Peter Pascucci, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Ava Benjamin Shore. We have the privilege of welcoming a truly remarkable and unique cinematographer, Jomo Fray. Jomo's work is characterized by its patience, rhythm, and poetic nature. These qualities come from Jomo's unique philosophy regarding work and the responsibility of a cinematographer. We're excited to dive into these themes today and hear from Jomo about his work and approach. But before we get started, we wanted to highlight some recent titles and acclaim Jomo's narrative feature work has received, including Selah and the Spades, which screened at Sundance in 2019, Port Authority, which screened at the Cannes Film Festival that same year, the breathtakingly powerful film All Dirt Road's Taste of Salt, which was at Sundance in 2023 and received a nomination for Best Cinematography at the Indie Spirit Awards, and most recently, The Young Wife, which screened at South by Southwest in 2023. Jomo has also worked on Barry Jenkins' The Underground Railroad and was selected by the ASC in 2022 as a rising star of cinematography. So, Jomo, knowing your ethos and your philosophy and your incredibly powerful body of work, I know that today's conversation is going to be really special and it's going to teach us something. So I'm personally just incredibly excited to dig in, and we're just so grateful to have you on the show. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to start a little broad, but I think it's an interesting question, just a thought that came up listening to you talk a bit. But I was curious to hear if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about the responsibility of a cinematographer. And I think it's one of those questions that can have like an obvious sort of practical answer, but hearing you speak about it and sort of the weight of it and how in some instances directors will have sat with an idea for 1 to 5 years, and it's our kind of responsibility to shepherd that into the world and visualize it. So I'd love to hear you talk about how sensitive and important that responsibility can be.
Yeah, it's something that I really do try to take seriously as not only an image maker, but as a collaborator. Because as you were saying, oftentimes these directors are thinking about this idea, marinating inside this idea for 2 to 5 years, sometimes longer. Sometimes it's about their own personal life. Sometimes it's about them unpacking something in a friend's life. But oftentimes it is these concepts that they are living with for a long time that I think that it really is a deep responsibility for us as collaborators and as cinematographers to treat that with the weight that it deserves. You know, I think we're lucky in a way that we can jump between these projects, that we can live within a project that someone else has marinated in for 5 years and then jump onto another project where someone else has marinated for 3 years. But I think that that really gets to the very core of why I like to have such an organic process when it comes to shot listing, when it comes to creating a visual language for a piece, as a way to honor and respect the time and the thought that they have put into this work, and to allow the images to kind of organically grow out of the conversations they've been having with themselves, the conversations they start having with you, and to really try to make an image that is completely bespoke to that story, is completely handmade for that narrative, those emotions, and this director today. Yeah, I think that is of tantamount importance. And yeah, just respecting an artist putting in their blood, their tears, and their sacrifice, like the amount of birthdays that they haven't gone to because they were writing the script, the amount of things that they've missed in their lives. I think that that's something that I really try to put on my shoulders when it's taking this movie to try to really kind of visualize it and physicalize it.
I love you referring to it as like the handmade quality, because I think that's so evident in the work. And I think like it was fascinating to hear you say, whether it's maybe like 100% true or not, but just the fact that like you've never used the same camera lenses on a project. You know, you hear this often that like every project should have its own look and its own sort of thing, but to focus it on that so precisely, that concept of it being bespoke and handmade is really cool.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of the fun for me, to be quite honest. Like, I don't know, there's a way in which that this could sound irresponsible, or rather a more responsible DP might say like, oh, it's really in mastering the tools and then seeing these stories through an extension of your mastery. But I kind of love doing different lenses and a different camera and a different LUT over every project, because it really creates a process where I'm learning the image as we're shooting. Like, that is something that is kind of fun for me. And also I think that it puts me in the right headspace to be learning what the movie is as we're making the movie, rather than to come to the images like, I know exactly how this will play. I know exactly how this LUT and these lenses will react to this scenario. I think that that's a very smart way to make a movie. I just happen to not do it myself, because I think that the kind of tension that it creates when I'm trying to focus on my mastery and the understanding of the relationships of light and camera movement, but not precisely a mastery of necessarily the singularity of my tools as they combine. Like I find it fun to kind of be surprised how a lens reacts to a LUT in a certain scenario.
I find it really interesting to hear about you creating a bespoke image for each film that you're working on. And yet I still feel like there's a unity to the work that you release. And I kind of feel like that might have something to do with not necessarily the aesthetics, but perhaps the filmmakers who you're working with that might share a similar vision of what filmmaking can be. And I was just curious, like, what do you admire in a director? And do you have a process of how you select a project that is offered to you? Because I think it can be really difficult to turn things down, especially when, like you said, someone's been working on this for years.
No, that's a really beautiful question. I think something that a lot of the directors that I work with share is a pretty aggressive form of their own humanism. I think that I, as a filmmaker, am constantly fascinated about humans. I'm constantly fascinated about our ability to reconcile the irreconcilable, and just living in existence is a weird process. And I think that directors who are really trying to go deep in trying to unpack who we are and what it is about us that's unique, of the emotions, the vulnerability, the tragedy, or the beauty of that experience, that can manifest in a million different ways. It can manifest in comedy, sci-fi, whatever. But I think that a director who's really focused on humanity at some level, and also someone who has a really artorist vision. I think the things that I really fell in love with cinema are, this maybe is like half cynical, but I think that there's a way in which we've told most of the conceivable stories. Like, I think that at some level, sure, there are more stories to be told, but at some level, I almost feel as if they are mutations on maybe core archetypes or core different ways of telling stories. And that can differ culture to culture. And those structures and those ideas, whether it's a 3-act, 5-act, 9-act. But I think at some core level, the basic structure and design of stories, we have kind of had thousands of years to think through. So it really then becomes a question to me of not necessarily the story you're telling, but how are you telling this story? How is that story kind of being siphoned or passing through a singular body, a singular imagination, a body with a very specific set of experiences of trials and tribulations through a director? That becomes really fascinating to me, thinking through what those stories are through them. So I think that I love working with people who do have that really strong and specific vision. I think for us as cinematographers, I often find that it is easier and it's just fun to help build, as we were talking about, a bespoke image from a director who has a specific vision, who has specific things that they want to feel. So then our job, I think, becomes something closer to a translator. We are translating, we are trying to almost take their dreams into us and then physicalize them, make them very real things, turn them into physical aberrations or ways the camera's moving So that always excites me when someone has a really unique vision and they're focused on things that I think are also important. Towards your other question on picking projects, I think that there's a way in which we often talk about our power being the power to say yes to project, what we say yes to. And I actually think that we are more powerful in the position of what we say no to. Because what we say no to, especially early on in our career, actually sets up almost the drawing of a portrait of ourselves in the negative. The things we say no to are the things that we are not, which then makes a more kind of detailed image of the person we are, of the artist we are, of the things that we care about, that I would and really just implore people to be open to saying no to things that just don't feel like your ethos, because that's all right. And also, I think that that ultimately actually respects the director who's asking you to come onto their project. Like when I sign onto a project, I want to truly believe that I am one of the best people in the world to do this project. And that's not to say that I think I am the best cinematographer in the world, but it's to say that I truly believe how this story passes through my body, I have to be one of the people to tell it. And I truly believe I could be one of the best to help manifest this story and bring it to life. That I have, as a cinematographer, as a collaborator, I have a dog in the race. Like I have something that I want to express. Like I think that it's often a case of, I feel like, sometimes DPs can say like, oh man, I read this script and I could just see it. It looks so beautiful. I want to do it. I kind of only want to say yes to a project if I read a script and I'm like, I have no idea how to shoot this movie. I don't know what this is going to look like. Because when I say I don't know what this is going to look like, to me, that tells me, okay, this is going to challenge me. This is going to fundamentally push me to have to find images that I don't know what they look like. I will have to work with the director to find those things, which goes along with kind of some of the things I've been saying of just trying to put myself in a position where I have to actively question the script, myself as a man, as an artist, as a collaborator. I just find that that is a really helpful space for me to kind of put me into a certain headspace to do the project. That is both scary, but also really exciting. So yeah, I often like working with people who have a specific vision, something I haven't really heard of before and don't really know how we're going to find that, because the beauty becomes in the process being the product. The product of the film is an extension of the process it was of us trying to find that image, trying to find that world, trying to realize it.
Wow. Yeah, what you said about trying to reconcile the irreconcilable is such an interesting way to enter into a project or a relationship, or think about stories that you're attracted to. It's really fascinating. I think this is a good segue into this question we had about style. I feel like there's a common question that's asked to cinematographers about whether our work is distinguishable or if we have a distinct style. And I found that the typical answer is that the work should adapt to the project, making a DP style secondary or even like irrelevant if the story is told well. And when you were asked this question, I heard in an interview, I found it really refreshing how you described not wanting to disappear. And it got me thinking about the importance of legacy. And I was curious sort of how you imbue like your distinct style and emotionality into a project without distracting from it, because I thought that response was just really like more nuanced, and it felt like the next step in that conversation. And I'd love to hear you talk about your desire to not disappear and how you approach your style of shooting.
Yeah, I think that is oftentimes a common adage of like, I want to disappear. I want to not feel the cinematography. And I'm always asking the question, why? It's a visual medium. It is a medium that is predicated on showing reality from a set of people who made something. And it might come from being an artist of color and also feeling like there's already been so much erasure of kind of the interaction of, for me, particularly Black artists, that I don't want to disappear. I don't want to be unheard in my images. And also both on the double edge of that, both having myself imbued inside the image and also having myself to take responsibility for being the person who helped author some of these images. Because that is important to me. And again, it goes back to the same question of what I see in a director. It's what I love in movies is to see the specificity of the people who made it, to really see them either struggling, unpacking, or trying to understand certain ideas and certain concepts like that. That's really beautiful to me. So within my own work, I kind of never try to do that. But I also never want that feeling to overtake the movie. So really what I mean by that is that I do want to make something that feels very specific for this movie. I don't want my ego to be in it, but I do want my perspective to be in it. And I think that comes from really trying to mine the script, doing, a script analysis with the director, going through line by line in the script to ask, whose perspective is this coming from within the script? How should we feel as an audience, and how do they feel as a person inside this moment? And then building the visual language off of that. So in that way, it's not me coming to a project and projecting my intellectualizations on the project. These people, are disconnected. So at the beginning of the movie, they're not in the same frame. And by the end of the movie, they're inside every frame. Like, that's a fine way to work. I just try to not necessarily project my way of understanding it onto the film. I almost want the film to grow organically, and out of that, you feel those things both through the performance, through the sound design, through the cinematography, through the direction, but not necessarily have that kind of idea projected onto it. But all of my ideas are coming through my body, how I connect to the idea of loneliness, how I connect to the ideas of melancholy, how I consider love. So when a director is saying they want to do a scene with X, Y, or Z around those ideas, like, I pull from my life. I pull from the things that I know, and I put that forward to my director to say, like, does this feel like that for you? And in that way, I don't want to pull it away from myself. I don't want to make it seem like that isn't Jomo inside those images, because I do want my images to have my blood in them. But I don't want those things to be distracting per se, but I like seeing style in a way. I love seeing how it changes. I'm thinking about cinematographers such as like Emmanuel Lubezki or Darius Kanji. Like, they are in every single one of their movies. Yes, that thing changes. So who Emmanuel Lubezki is with Terrence Malick versus who he's with Cuarón is like, yeah, that's very different. But there is still that person behind the camera. And that, I think, is exciting and is the reason why we are interested by Picasso over time, which I think really gets to your core question behind the question, is the concept of legacy. And I make movies because I know that someday I won't be on the planet Earth. I will pass away, and I want to leave these objects for my family, for the people I leave behind, of the person I was at different stages in my life. And it's like, sure, the movies aren't about me. The movies are about the director. They're about telling these stories. But it's almost like a tailor who signs his name into the garments that he makes. Like, that's kind of how I think about cinema, and kind of how I think about films, is that I do want aspects of me inside every movie, because those are a document of how I felt about marriage at this point in my life, how I felt about depression in that point in my life, how I felt about love at this point in my life. And I think that is in my own internal curation of the movies that I pick to work on, the movies that I do work on, and the work that's in those movies are ideally kind of reflections of me at very specific times, which is, again, why I kind of like to pick movies that feel like they challenge me fundamentally, or like, I don't know what I think about this idea. So I'll take a movie because I don't know what I think about either the politics or the internal emotional life of an idea. So I'll take it being like, okay, well, over the course of this movie and talking with the director for 4 months about this idea, I'll probably come out at the other side with some more of an understanding about this concept. And I hope that is in the work, and that the people that have it after I leave can see myself inside of those moments. That kind of is one of the beautiful aspects of filmmaking to me, is that we are all kind of emotionally journaling and showing each other, and that we kind of end up getting a library, if we're lucky, having a long career, of all of these journal entries over a long period of time that people can look back on and try to understand us and see the trajectory in our art and what we were interested, what we weren't interested in certain times. I think that that's important and really beautiful.
That was such a beautiful, nuanced answer. You know, what's so interesting about what you said is I think that there's a lot of ways that I think you can intellectualize what you just said. But the way that I interpret some of it is that intellectually, you're saying sometimes the things I take, I don't know how they're going to look. But how I'm also interpreting what you say is that I'm also listening to myself, my voice, and you're working within a space of trust and of comfort with that person, you know? So it's almost like it's risky, but it's risky in a good way, right?
No, I think that that's it precisely. I think that's it precisely is like, that's the joy of the practice to me, genuinely. I think it's one of those things where, you know, again, like, you know, a responsible DP would say, oh, you know, I become a better DP when like I've put more hours on a geared head, when I like really mastered a techno crane, when I know blocking down. And that is true. And that is real. And I also think that I become a better DP when I am a better son, when I'm a better husband, when I have a conversation that leads me to being a better friend, when I am forced to be compassionate or change my views outside of filmmaking. I genuinely think when I then come back to filmmaking, I weirdly find myself seeing images I didn't see before, almost as if expanding my emotional spectrum, my internal emotional spectrum, kind of like a video game allows certain like new kind of skills to pop up. Because I do think that, like, yes, this is all very metaphysical and all these things. But genuinely, I think that ultimately, cinematography is amazing because the more thoughtful you are as a human, I think the better the work just gets. Because the work is about humans, so of course it would be. And thus, I think that I try to put myself in risky situations where I am forced to learn, because then I learn more, which to me is like, great. I just learn a lot more that I get to put back into the work on the next project. I learn more and then put back in on the next project. And I'm just very grateful for that aspect of this industry, because I do think that the more thoughtful you are as a person, the better you become at your work, both as a manager and as an artist. And that isn't always true for a lot of industries.
I think like that reminded me of something that you said that I thought was so interesting, which is that like you're more inspired by someone like Stanislavski than you are by like Ansel Adams. And like, I think from the POV of a DP to say that, it's just so interesting. You know, I think it really gets to the core of wanting to let the technical kind of fade away and focus more on the blocking and the performance and the relationships.
Absolutely. I think the technical is important. And I think the technical comes with more shooting. But if you don't have anything to shoot, then I think the technical actually starts becoming irrelevant. So I try to focus on having things to shoot, knowing that over time I will naturally just become better at the technical aspects of shooting itself. But I don't necessarily fetishize those aspects of the technology or being technically perfect. And I try to focus on the things that are more ineffable. And to me, the things that are harder to actually know and thus to re-articulate into an image. So I think it really just comes down to the question of investment. Like, where do you invest time into becoming better at what we do?
I'd love to ask you about maybe a technical thing here. And I think it is a little bit related to what you were saying earlier about putting yourself into the work. Because I think that what's interesting about what you said earlier, like being a person of color, and I think if you come from a marginalized community, the context of how you view images is maybe different than if you're not coming from a marginalized community, because you're almost aware, whether it's conscious or not, of the ways in which imagery has harmed, stereotyped, or deformed what you know and love. So it's almost like, I think it's really powerful to say that you also want to be seen in the work. And I think that the aesthetic choices you make are also power in like reshaping that idea of what you're shooting?
Definitely. I think that image making, this goes beyond image making. I think it's like art itself is that as filmmakers, we are designing how people's imagination thinks and the images that they see. Like science fiction, for example, is never about the future. It's about the present and usually about the past. But in creating those images, you are creating what the human mind visually sees as progress. Like there's a reason that iPads look like iPads. And I think that that's because of like a lot of science fiction in the 80s and Star Trek seeing like glass screens as elegant. You know, that's a small example, but it's to say that in creating images, we create the very view of how people, what they see as their possibilities. And that's a powerful thing. And I think that cameras are a powerful thing. I think images are a deeply powerful thing within our society, which again, kind of taking on a director, there's a great responsibility to that. And I think as you're saying, like, of course, being a person of color, you have experienced how those images can be weaponized against you. But I think all people can see and connect to that thing of like images have a tremendous amount of power. And with that power comes a responsibility to be really thoughtful in how you're using it and what they're saying. And like, you know, we so much of cinematography is thinking about the subconscious and subtextual language behind an image. Ultimately, I think that's a lot of what we do. We translate what a director wants in a scene to create that subtext and put it in a way that not only is imbued within the image, but ideally is understandable enough for a person to see that image and kind of have that idea incepted inside of them. You're watching a scene in The Mood for Love, the slow tracking dolly shots, that incepts in you this idea of the longing. There's nothing intrinsic about those things that connect to longing, but I would say that, you know, it's the skill of Mark Lee Ping Bing and Christopher Doyle and Wong Kar-wai to create these images that make you feel a thing. And I think that that is a very powerful effect. You know, a person can go into a movie not thinking that they have childhood trauma and experience a movie and in watching it unlock, oh, actually, like, my childhood was pretty weird and I know these feelings, and like, that's kind of incredible. That is a crazy thing, which I think again just comes back to we have a responsibility as image makers to think about the power of those images. There have been wars that have been fought on an image. So yeah, I think that that's just something to always be thinking about, no matter what your kind of background is. But again, yes, I think that those who are marginalized have felt those images work against them, so they're super cognizant of and know the power of those images. But I think it's for all of us to really consider just the subconscious language that's in everything we do, which is the power and which is what makes it exciting and cool. And also, I think, something worthy of being thoughtful with.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would hope that, more broadly speaking, it is considered every time someone hops onto a project to like consider the power of that. I wanted to ask about a specific technical thing, because I think when it comes to exposure, I was curious to ask you about something. Like, I would put you in a group of cinematographers with like Bradford Young or Chase Irvin, who obviously like beautifully render darker skin tones by way of underexposure. It's not that you just make people look gorgeous on screen, but I also find with you and the aforementioned DPs also choose to photograph darker skin with a larger embrace that allows it to fall deeper and deeper into like subtle shades of darkness. I'm thinking of even to a point of like pure blackness, like silhouettes or eyes falling into complete darkness under hats or in murky environments. Now, given filmmaking's problematic history and filmmakers these days wanting to get it, quote unquote, right, how do you approach these conversations with a director? And are there ever times when you're asked to add exposure when you think that maybe the correct approach is to go darker?
I mean, definitely honored to be thought of in the company of both Chase and Bradford, who are, I'm very fortunate to hold as mentors and friends and people who have really helped guide and support me throughout my career. But yeah, to answer that question, I'll say this. I sound like I am only interested in the metaphysics of image making, but both of my parents were scientists. I love technical things. I grew up only with getting presents, which were Bunsen burners with spinning plates from their lab, and would do weird experiments for most of my childhood. So I love technical stuff. So it's to say that what I'm going to say, I don't mean to be a cop-out in trying to get around a technical question. But in terms of rendering people of color, I think that to get to a place, maybe a more nuanced or interesting place, or not even that, the place that I think about it is that I try to come to it not really trying to look for, what is the trick? What is the unlocking gesture? Where should I put it? What zone should I expose someone's skin? Or, how many IREs should they be keying at? Or what kind of light sources? I don't think that there's necessarily a technical trick to rendering people of color well. To me, it kind of comes back to the way to render anyone is to see them as human. And then once I'm seeing them as human, then it's a question of, well, what is this human who is worthy of feeling, has an intrinsic dignity to them, whether they are an evil, terrible, hateful person, or whether they're someone lovable in the story. They have an intrinsic dignity to them of being human. And then what is that person feeling? And then how could I render that feeling through light and through camera motion? I think is the question I'm always asking, the question I always have kind of asked. But I think that from asking that question, I then don't really think cognitively about this person is darker skinned and I'm putting them in a very dark image. They won't be seen. But I think it really comes back to, I don't think everyone is always seen through illuminating them, fundamentally. So again, once those things are disconnected to me, then it becomes, but in my life as Jomo, I've seen. My grandmother was very dark-skinned. I've seen her in dark rooms. Why would I illuminate this actor when I have seen my own grandmother in a dark room? And there was a certain beauty to the humanity of that, of why was she in this dark room? And honoring the oddness either of the image or of that moment or of that place of where you can barely see someone, that to me is emotional. That's cinematic. So it's never a cognitive thing to let me light this person darkly who is dark. But I think that there's an inherent quality about the strangeness maybe sometimes of an image of someone who is dark being in a dark space, or trying to make the camera render people the way that I understand them in real life when I see them. When I see someone who perhaps is very dark skinned with a lot of blue in their skin, so it really has this obsidian look to it, then if I'm trying to render them on the camera neutrally, I want to render them as they look to my eye. And that's kind of what I really trust, rather than, again, going back to this idea of how do I illuminate them for the image? How do I make them seen for the image? Again, it's, for me, disconnecting the idea of to see someone is not necessarily to illuminate them, but it's to see them as they are, to see them as the human they are, to see them as the person they are, to see them as they render inside this room. With my eyes, I'm seeing it. And if their skin is naturally sucking in light, then I'm not going to necessarily use more light so that they are rendered in full, so that there's detail in their hair. But I don't really see detail in their hair. So why am I trying to find detail in their hair in this image? Again, these are the questions I think I ask that bring me to a certain space in making the image, or that helps me know what I should protect and what I shouldn't protect in the image, when, of course, an image has a limited amount of dynamic range. So like all things, that's why I really love shooting with the zone system and thinking about the zone system, because I think that in hitting that on a meter, you're not necessarily getting, where should I put the exposure? When you're looking through a spot meter and it's telling you what zone it's in, it is answering your question with another question of, this is where the exposure of this part of the image is in your image. where do you want it to be as it relates to everything else in the rest of the scene, as it relates to the other zones in this image? That to me, I think is really, I find a helpful question back to ask to me, where it's like, okay, well, do I want this in a zone 6? And then if that's at a zone 6, how is that relating with all of the other things inside this image? So again, that's kind of the question I'm always asking myself is, how do I render this person as they are? And then on top of that, maybe I'm grafting an emotion or a subconscious idea on top of that. But fundamentally, it's asking the question of like, but how do they render to my eyes? How do they look inside this room? And let me start with that, and then let me build off the emotions from that. And usually that just brings me to a place of like, dark skin is dark. So I want it to be rendered as I experience it and as it experiences light, which is not to have necessarily an iridescent or an illuminating quality the same way that sometimes Caucasian skin does, or sometimes like paler skin does, which again is always asking the same question to me of like, when I see someone who is Caucasian, like, okay, well, how are they rendered in reality? And like, again, it goes back to like, they have an intrinsic dignity to them. Okay, let me truly see them. Let me see the actor. Let me see the character. Okay, they have red in their undertones. Then, maybe I won't put a blue light to try to neutralize that, but to like allow the natural ruddiness of their cheeks to exist within that. And then it's about rendering them as they are. And then it's about adding on the layer on top of that, of adding on the drama and the subconscious kind of things that the director and I have been talking about, adding that onto the images. That's kind of how I think I structure my approach, pretty agnostic to skin tone. So in a way, I feel like shooting people of color is the same process that I do of shooting Caucasian actors. And there isn't a trick that I use or necessarily a thing or an approach that changes for that thing. It always is just a question about the scene, the character, how they feel, and how do they interrelate with the other exposures and the other things that are happening inside that scene.
Wow. Such an incredible response. I think like, I don't know, it got me thinking about this question that Ava has posed in the past about like being emotionally open when operating or when in the midst of a scene. And, I think like it's got me thinking so much about how like everything does need to be real. Like it does need to be seen and it needs to be felt in order for it to be captured in that way. And I just feel that watching your work, that's so apparent, but hearing you describe how that technique is applied visually specifically rather than maybe more so related to like how we need to be emotionally open to experiencing things happening is just so fascinating. Yeah. I think like it completely tracks with the work.
Thank you so much.
So I think going back a little bit to what you were saying about sort of incepting ideas and playing with the subconscious when it comes to image making, I was curious to hear you talk a little bit about a philosophy of yours of striving to make work that is symbolic rather than metaphorical. And I think that when I heard you talk about this idea, it made sense conceptually, but then when I was watching All Dirt Road's Taste of Salt and it got to the scene of the funeral and we're sort of tracking these moments and these scenes, and then all of a sudden there's just like a shot of like a butterfly, and it just was such a distinct moment in the rhythm of that film, and something clicked for me for sure that made your telling of that approach of symbolism so clear, like in an emotional way. And I was just interested to hear you talk about that philosophy.
Oh, I love that connection to that seed at Dirt Roads. Yeah, for me, it is, I think that when I'm thinking about images, I'm always trying to think about how to make an image dialectic. And by that, I mean an image that is in dialogue, in conversation with the viewer, and an image that has a thesis, has an antithesis, and forms into a synthesis. And the synthesis is the meaning that you take away from the images. That ideally, I think it's creating images that allow the viewer to kind of slot in their experiences, the specificity of their lives. And those are always the movies that I think really connected with me the most. When I think about movies like Small Deaths or Ratcatcher by Lynn Ramsey, when I think about the movies of Terrence Malick, when I think about Killer of Sheep, when I think about Daughters of the Dust, these are movies to me that are in conversation with the viewer. They are not preaching to the viewer. Another movie, Hale County, are movies that I feel like are in dialogue with us when we sit inside the theater. And I think that always seems so particularly strong and interesting because it allows the story to have kind of a bespoke reading, and that two people could be sitting in the movie and they come out after watching Hale County and they're like, oh my God, the movie is this to me. And then someone was like, oh my God, the movie was this for me. Both people are correct. Both people are right, because actually the movie itself was basically a Rubik's Cube that would form into the exact Rubik's Cube that could fit the person whose hand it is being held in. And so getting back to the idea of metaphoric versus symbolic, one of the ways in which I think about that is when I'm making images, creating images that, to me, symbolic, I am meaning to mean kind of the indirect suggestion to express an emotional idea. And in that way, the indirectness of how it sets meaning allows the viewer to interpret, find meaning within the image. And just because I have an interpretation doesn't mean that that is the complete and end-all be-all interpretation. And that it doesn't mean that your interpretation that's different than my interpretation is invalid. In a way that I think a metaphor, I think of as a metaphor, like a simile, is a structure of this is like that. So actually it is about you knowing the meaning of it, is that the image has a very specific meaning and is trying to get across. Of course, the director and I have a primary meaning that we want to get across in that moment, but it isn't necessarily the only way for you to interpret that image. And I think that it's like creating images that kind of are open to being interpreted in multiple ways allows the movie to actually be a very specific thing for each and every singular viewer who sees it, which to me allows the movie to kind of have a much longer life and a much longer lifespan. You know, an example of something that I think is symbolic but not metaphoric is thinking about the monolith at the end of 2001: Space Odyssey. Sure, there are things that we can all connect to of like, this is what I think it means. But really, the movie doesn't necessarily rely on you understanding one metaphor of what the monolith is and what the white room that he finds himself in the end is specifically. It actually is open to a lot of interpretations, and a lot of interpretations that are kind of equally valid. And I think because of that, it actually allows the movie to last a much longer time, because as time changes, as politics change, as people change their consideration of filmic language, it still has something to offer. It still has something to be in conversation with. When I think that sometimes movies that maybe more have a metaphoric meaning, I think they're really great for the time and place that they're in, but sometimes just kind of fall out of usefulness 20 years later because it's like, oh yeah, well, this is obvious what they're trying to say here. Yes, women are also humans. You know, but then a movie that I would say kind of brings you more into dialogue with itself, I would almost argue that that's a movie, and a movie that maybe is using more symbolic language is a movie that's kind of open to multiple interpretations by you, even as a viewer, over different times in your life. And I think that there's nothing wrong with making movies in a metaphoric fashion. They just maybe aren't the ones that I often find myself gravitating towards as much personally. And the ones that I see at different times in my life and feel like they still have something more to teach me on every viewing, those are the movies that kind of always have blown my mind around what film can be capable of. And those just became my deep interest in, like, hopefully someday making a movie that has that same aspect and energy to it. Like when I think of Tarkovsky's The Mirror, that's a movie that every time I return to it, I feel like I see and learn something else about my relationship with my mother. Like it's powerful in that way. And, you know, it doesn't have to just be these very kind of like heady movies. Like I think this about Empire Strikes Back. Every time I see it, I feel like I see something kind of different about the relationship of Luke to his father, of being a father seeing a son. That's really an incredible, incredible aspect to me of cinema that I think that sometimes is easy to maybe not pay attention to, in the same way that I think in painting and in sculpture, there is more space because it is so naturally interpretive, and that it's harder in some of those cases to have a set metaphor or interpretation that this thing is meaning to say, that I think it is naturally a little bit more kind of harder to pin down, that it can last longer periods. And I think that that's an aspect that I really try to invite into my own filmmaking and how I work with directors and how we kind of create images, is ideally shooting an image that invites the viewer into it, invites the viewer's life into the image, the monolith. Those images they shoot in 2001, I think that they invite the viewer into understanding them. I think that images in Chungking Express, of like some of the images inside the bedroom when Fei Wong sneaks in, there's a certain type of aliveness and youth to it that invites the viewer to remember the first time you fell in love. And I think that that's a really special and interesting quality that I really try to prioritize when I make images.
Yeah. Speaking of your own filmmaking, I'd love to get into All Dirt Roads. You know, this is a film that I'd seen a lot about and finally watched in preparation for this. And my first reaction to it was, thank God that people are making movies like this. You know, I was just so struck by it feeling like some of the movies you referenced, you know, like Mirror or something from Tarkovsky, where it's like something that is speaking to an extremely deep human experience. Everything felt so absolutely singular and perfect about it, but you weren't projecting images or feeding anything that didn't need to be there, you know? Now, given like the non-linearity and experiential nature of Dirt Roads, I'm curious to know how that script read. Was it traditionally written, or was it more of an outline? And then how did you and Raven start to break that down from there? Like, did you know that going into it that you would be elaborating on scenes and visuals that might not always be reflected in the page?
First off, thank you so much. That is so moving to hear you describe it that way. And I mean, geez, even be compared to some of those references is truly the highest honor. And at some level, I feel like Raven and I, what excited us were those first times we saw like Small Deaths, and then saying like, could we make something that could make someone else excited the same way we were excited when we first saw some of those films? So that means a lot to hear. In terms of how the script was written, Raven Jackson, the director, is an incredible writer, like an incredible writer. She was a trained poet before coming into filmmaking, so kind of her lens always is viewed through that. But there's a funny way, because the movie is very abstract seeming, that the script would be that way, but actually the script is almost word for word kind of what you see on the screen. And she's really incredible at having deeply just emotional descriptions. I would compare her to an author kind of like Cormac McCarthy, where their descriptions are just, they take you to another place instantly. But because of that, of course, those descriptions are poetic in nature. So that's kind of where then the creative process starts coming in. She'll write in the lighting. She'll write in, you know, that there's a subtle dance of light on the back wall as the sun pushes through a curtain to give you that sense of the room. She'll write about the heat that's in the room. And I think that became a big thing for us in the early prep process of like, how do you shoot an image that when you're sitting watching it, you feel the sweat? How do you shoot an image that you can smell? Like, how do you create an image that invites a sensorial experience of you conjuring other feelings to it, which really became a super fun process in kind of breaking that script down. So it was, you know, a traditionally written script. And then the process for us was shot listing that whole film and kind of going through line by line and talking about what are the emotions at every stage, who's feeling it, what are they feeling, and kind of organically building the visual language, not as something that we projected onto the script, but more as just naturally, organically growing it out of scene by scene by scene as we went through and shot listed the movie. And so we shot listed the whole film pretty intensely, like thinking about the transitions between each scene, thinking about the shots that we would get and how they would cut together. So really thinking in a just deeply unpoetic and very technical sense. The mics we would use, how that would edit, like kind of going through everything. And so that was almost one track. And then the other track we were also doing as we were doing that is that we had spent some time, a week we had spent together outside of prep, where we just sat down and looked at art together. We looked at tons of photo books. We watched tons of movies. We would stay up late just talking about emotions, about family. And it was kind of out of that real intensive of just 7 days of only spending with each other, we built this visual manifesto. And the visual manifesto for us was a set of rules or practices that we wanted to consider throughout the process. And, you know, some aspects about this is that we opened ourselves up to having contradiction within the manifesto, knowingly so. Again, it was trying to create, which kind of goes back to the same conversation about symbology and dialectic filmmaking. We wanted a process that forced us to be in the process of interpreting this movie every single day, interpreting the movie that it wanted to be. Which again sounds very kind of metaphysic, but actually it isn't. On a very real sense, it kind of goes, in its most simplest version is like, okay, the scene was written to be a sunny day, but today when we're shooting it, it's raining. So instead of pushing more HMIs through the window to make it seem as if it is the sunny day that was written in the script, it's about, okay, it's raining. We don't have the tools or the equipment to change that. So let's lean into the fact that it is raining and let's build that into the scene. Let's build that into a part of the scene. But because we had done just so much deep diving work doing a script analysis together and going through the 120 pages of it, doing this emotional deep dive together, we knew the script inside and out, and we knew the core emotion of every scene and of every beat inside the scene. So then actually reforging it or pivoting actually became a much simpler process because we knew what we were there to get. And we also had the manifesto as, here are tenets to how to find the type of cinema that we were interested in. So it was kind of a twofold approach where it is being aggressively organized and then having this process that maybe prioritizes what's happening in the moment more than it prioritizes sticking to the organization of the film you said you would make. And I think that that is how some of those images came about, because before Raven had written a word down on the page, she said, I want to shoot a movie that captures the ineffable moments about life. Okay, that's impossible. That seems like such an impossible challenge of like, how do you capture the small wonderments of a life inside of a practice like filmmaking that is about repeatability, that is about scheduling, that is about hitting things over a certain time period of a day. So the challenge of balancing those two things is hard. But how we kind of formed doing it on that project was, again, having a really structured, a direct plan that, you know, we would joke that if one of us had a brain aneurysm and fell down, with the shot list and the intensity of the specifics of it, our team could shoot the rest of that day as if we were there on set, because it was written there on the page of every movement the camera makes, what it sees at different beats, where it goes, what's the energy of it, what lens it's on. And I think we did that organization so that on the day, we could throw it away. We could throw it away when something more interesting was happening. When it started raining, we could throw it away and integrate the rain into that scene. When it was sunny and we were hoping for a more somber day, we could integrate that sun into the scene. When two actors weren't getting along, we can integrate that into the scene. And I think that it's something that a mentor of mine that we had already talked about, Chase Irving, has really pushed into me over the years, of this idea of honoring the cinema on set. And when I say cinema, I mean the inherent fascinating aspects about being human. Like, honor the cinema that you're seeing on location on that day. Honor the light, honor the relationships, honor what you're seeing in front of you, because that's just so much more electric than any machination a human could hope to have writing 3 years before, which again is honor that script, honor the emotions that led us to be there. But also, I just oftentimes feel like earlier in my career, I would do so much pushing against something more interesting happening in front of me, because I'm like, no, that's not the plan. The plan was we did this. So we need to kill that and we need to get this. Yeah, the light's beautiful here, but let's get that HMI up because my plan's a good plan. And I think that at this stage in my, like, on the path of this profession, I feel like I'm just in a different place where actually the things that are the most beautiful are the things that are kind of surprising, are the things that, that's not necessarily how I imagine the scene, but wow, this has the kind of imperfection that actually just makes it feel truly perfect and makes it feel unplanned. So I think that for a movie like Dirt Roads especially, that is so kind of open to poetics, but I think even in other projects that I work on, or even things like commercials that are a bit more rigid in their design, I always love to choose tools or choose a team or choose a structure that can be adaptable, that can shift and mold to more interesting things in front of us. And if we don't see those things, well, we've got a great plan that we've talked about a lot about hitting and will work. So we'll go with that.
Hi, we are excited to announce our partnership with Laowa Lenses by Venus Optics. Laowa has had a long history of providing cinematographers with unique and state-of-the-art lens options, including their recent Proteus 2x anamorphic series, which remains the most accessible T2.0 option in the market for professional production. A big thank you to SanDisk for helping support our show as well as part of their relentless reliability campaign. The extreme portable solid-state drive has become an essential on film sets and a personal favorite of mine for how durable, reliable, and fast it is. SanDisk leads in drive and memory card technology, emphasizing not just storage, but everything worth keeping. We'd also like to thank our partner at Fujifilm. We're very grateful to them for supporting not just the podcast, but a lot of what we do at the Cinematography Salon. And with the release of their latest camera, GFX 100 II, they release a tool that opens up new creative possibilities. It's brands like these that remind us why we do what we do. It's more than just support. It's about being part of a community that values every shot and every story. So, Jomo, hearing about this technique of the visual manifesto and sort of also this very detailed script analysis that you do with all the directors that you work with, it feels like all of this is in service of this sort of desire to be like hyper present when making a film. But hearing you talk, I also think that there seems to be this other element to creating that type of space, which involves the type of people that you bring on to a project and the crew that you bring on, and how you sort of empower them to also join in that feeling of being totally present to the story and having that reactivity. And I think I heard you say at one point that the closest you've been to like sort of seeing God in the context of a film set is when the crew is all working in concert and has that sort of presence and can be reactive, and when a beautiful moment happens. And so I think, like, in the context of All Dirt Roads, there were several scenes that had a very profound impact on me. I think some that come to mind were like the nonverbal hugging scene between Mac and Wood where she breaks down, or the scene in the tree where Wood tells Mac the story of his dad teaching him to swim. There's just so many examples in that film of scenes that just feel so transcendent. And I was just curious to hear you talk about that approach of bringing on crew and empowering them, and how that maybe plays into what's eventually created with these types of films.
Absolutely. I like to bring on and hire and work with filmmakers, not a first AC, a filmmaker in the position of first assistant. Like, I used to work camera crew. I know what it feels like to be a second AC or a first AC that just feels like a warm body who's there, who is essentially a biological machine hitting marks. And that always felt so demoralizing to me when I worked on those jobs that for me now as a cinematographer, it really feels important to me to always empower my crew to connect with the story and have opportunities to give art, to give cinema to the scenes. Like, I have never asked an AC where I wanted them to put focus throughout the scene. And the first thing I will tell someone upon coming onto a project like First AC is that I want you to follow the cinema that you see in the scene. And don't be afraid to take a risk about where you see the cinema. If we are on, I don't know, if we're on a close-up and they're talking and it seems as if the actor wants to disappear, they don't want to be seen, like, don't be afraid to rack to the background if that feels emotional to you. The worst comes to worst is like, we'll shoot the scene again. Or at the end of it, it's like, I like that instinct, but I think for this, I would rather stay here or there. But I'll never start with, hey, this is where I want things to be. Because to me, sure, sometimes you might lose a moment, but I think more times than not, you gain so much more than you lose. Empowering a person to be on set and to think and act autonomously like an artist. Because ultimately, it's like a thing I always tell myself where it's like, film just doesn't pay you enough for the amount of bullshit that we all do. So really, people are on set at every single level because they have a love of the game, because movies meant something to them at different points in their life. And of course, you know, there are places where we're fully professionalized and it is just labor. But at some core level, I think that's something that makes this different than a lot of other industries is that I do think at some point in that relationship came from a place of love for this thing. So I think that in my experience, actually allowing people to re-tap into that, whether it's a feature-length film, whether it's a short film, or whether it's a commercial, I just think you just get such spectacular work out of people when you allow them to imbue the scenes with their own meaning. And I think so too for gaffers. I think early on in my career, I was maybe a little bit more intense about like giving a lighting overhead of where I wanted everything, what units I wanted, how I wanted them placed, and what diffusions I wanted them to put on it. And I think that that was good. But I think that, again, even going back to some of the moments we were talking about in Dirt Roads where it's like the excitement of being surprised, I think has been way more interesting to me to give my key grip, give my gaffer, give my rigging team the script, have them read it, and then tell them, okay, so for this scene, what the director and I are thinking about is this scene is all about longing. What do you think? Like, how do you think we should express that in this space? And kind of giving people the space to actually think about, okay, for me, what does longing kind of mean to me? What units would I maybe grab for, which again, sure, this seems very kind of highfalutin, but again, I do think even asking the question that way usually has people more excited to give ideas. And when it's a space where people feel like they can give all of their ideas and give their best ideas as a cinematographer, then it puts you in a position of you're curating these ideas to figure out, based on the conversations you have had with the director, which of these would best connect to their movie. But I just always feel like it makes the work so much more dense and so much more heavier in that way. And again, even just thinking about something as symbolic, the more people who are placing in their versions of symbolism into it just further makes the image that much more open to multiple interpretation because it is multiple people interpreting it. And I think that that's also a really fascinating aspect of cinema, that it isn't like photography where it is a singular person manifesting their will. Cinema is an art of knowing your vision, but having to articulate it to many people. The director has to articulate it to me, the cinematographer. I have to articulate it to a gaffer, a key grip, a camera assistant, to a team. They have to articulate it down the line. Like that process of phone tag or like telephone actually is an aspect that's really, really fascinating. And I think makes this such a beautifully human art form. And one that again goes back to this idea of creating work that is imbued with so much symbology to it that someone sitting in a theater, they have a lot of ways into understanding the story, a lot of things that are built into the very texture of the image that they can latch onto. So I think that, again, it really goes back to, for me, of creating as many aspects of empowerment for the crew as I could possibly have as a manager and as a collaborator.
I love it. And I think that response totally deepens the concept of like our role being that of a translator. I think that hearing you say that earlier in the context of you translating the director's vision, but now hearing it in the context of the way that we translate that to our collaborators is so interesting.
And I think is the most exciting things come out of those kind of conversations. There's a way to think that actually more confusion would come out of it because it's further away from the source. But I actually think the opposite happens when it's done well, and when you have a strong leader and a strong director. I think it actually just gets stronger over time because it's more and more resonant.
It's really interesting. I find that in your work, there's a incredible specificity to place and to light. Like, obviously, All Dirt Roads is a great example of that. I would also say Port Authority, in a very different way, is also channeling something specific to a place, even though it is on the surface very different. I'm curious, how do you familiarize yourself with a film's locations and settings, and how does that inform your own lighting plan?
The ways that I think it informs my lighting plan and kind of my approach to lighting specifically, I think a lot of my approach comes from the cinematographer Nestor Almendros, and reading through his book and how he thinks about architecture, how he thinks about the design of a place. Like, when you think about it, it's like architecture is such an incredible art where it's one of the only arts that you live inside of, that you literally experience, and it mediates all of these interactions interpersonally with the people in your life. It was Frank Lloyd Wright, when he came up with this concept of the Usonian home, has always been a big inspiration for me. And in that design, Frank Lloyd Wright was really asking questions of, okay, how can I create an art form that helps and encourages people to be better versions of themselves? Of course, this is his definition of a better version of self, but how can we? So, for example, for these Usonian homes, they were kind of affordable homes that he started building in the United States for this up-and-coming and burgeoning middle class. And for this, he had designs where the bedrooms would be really small, the living rooms would be really large, as a way to kind of subconsciously push people towards, as a family, hanging out together. The kitchens were really small, the dining rooms were really big, to again encourage spaces where people would kind of share together, and the bedrooms would have east-facing windows to wake up with the sun. The kitchen would have a west-facing window so that you have light naturally coming in as you're cooking dinner, and the living rooms would be south-facing, so during the days it would have the most illumination. Like, that is someone thinking through the design of light and how light flows and moves through space. And Nestor would always write about that, where he would talk about, for location scouts, he would try to find locations that had thoughtful architecture, thoughtful spatial design. And for a lot of my lighting approach, I like to think that it's less traditional lighting and is more augmenting and shifting light, but kind of almost taking it like water, where it's something that moves through the space, and instead of damming it and then rebuilding it, I usually just kind of change the way that the river kind of flows through space, because actors are humans and they're often playing human characters. So there's a way in which humans interact with rooms, with space, which actually is an extension of how they interact with light. You know, a person will never walk into a dark corner of a room and start crying. That's strange. And if they do that, then that's cinematic and interesting because it is such a strange choice. So when I'm thinking about lighting 360, or if I'm thinking about lighting large spaces, I'm thinking about, well, how does light interact with this space naturally? And where can I put units and augment the light in ways that without giving an actor marks, the actor will naturally interact with that light in cinematic ways. You know, if you put a light next to a couch, a person will naturally find themselves drifting towards that light, drifting towards that couch, because in a way that's deeply natural to how humans interact with space, which again is this way of, I think about lighting as it relates to how I think about the design of a space. And I'll pick a space that feels like it is most conducive to light moving through it. Again, with the same principles Nestor is already saying, like, you know, a bedroom, or that Frank Lloyd Wright is saying, that a bedroom east facing, a living room south facing, a kitchen west facing. And in that way, I will often try to have natural light do the large lifting of my lighting, which isn't to say that I light naturally. I usually have a lot of units going and a lot of things happening, but I usually like to have units outside of set kind of pushing into the set and having that light kind of bounce around naturally, and without then giving marks to actors. They kind of end up finding themselves in very interesting relationship dynamics with light naturally. So I use a lot of mirrors. I use a lot of the CRLS system. I absolutely love. I really love reflected light because it has quality to it that I think is really specific. It oftentimes matches how light interacts with space, which is usually, you know, when we're thinking about the sun or we're thinking about day interiors, is usually a very powerful source from very far away. I think a mirror can help kind of add a little bit more of the reality of those relationships. So I find myself grabbing for those often. But again, it's building in lighting into the set and building in lighting from outside of the set, pushing through in ways that light likes to interact with space is kind of my approach in a lot of ways. And I think many of the films that I do, whether they might be surreal, expressionistic, or naturalistic, I think those concepts I usually try to stay the same, of thinking about a space, how does the space interact with light? And also in just a very real way, I like a set to have the least amount of artifice as I possibly can, to allow the actors to even further fall inside of the scene and fall inside of the emotions and feel as if they have the freedom to really just express themselves, and that the image will find them. And again, I think if you set up the room in a way that is naturally conducive to your lighting, even if they don't have marks, they will naturally find themselves in positions that will aid you, that will allow you to still shoot on the shadow side, that'll still allow there to be kind of like a natural wrap to itself, which again, I think is really just studying how light interacts with the room, obviously doing a lighting study of almost all the rooms I shoot in, and also just like at a very practical level, when I'm offset, I just observe light a lot. I just observe light in rooms a lot. I take a lot of nerdy pictures of like, oh yeah, this is like an interesting shape, or this is an interesting relationship, that like this sun bounced off of this glass building and has this really hard spot on the wall. And the way that that spot is kind of a side skip bounce that's really making this room have a certain feel to it. I think that so much of cinematography is actually just observation of real life as we live it outside of set, and then taking some of those observations and bringing them back to a more cinema context.
Yeah, I think it's a common idea to like not encumber talent with stands and grip and equipment, but this concept of like, it just tracks so beautifully with like your ethos of trusting that this person, this trained actor, this human will be able to find their light. Like, you know, it's such a term that's existed for so long, but like in this context, it's just super interesting and inspiring to hear that that's the way that you work.
I think it was Nestor who said that for the movie Marquis of O, that he basically didn't light because he would just have the production just move through the castle at different times of day. And it's like, especially a castle, which is before electrical lighting, the castle has to be built thinking through how light moves through the space. Like it has to be naturally lit in a way. And that for him, that was kind of this really unlocking moment of, oh, like if the building and the architectural design of this space is conducive to light moving through it, then actually our job becomes a lot easier. And again, it's not that it's like I only do that, most of my stuff is naturally lit. It is not. There is a lot of lighting that is happening around, but ideally it's non-invasive lighting. And that it's more about, I want my crew to do the best work we can with the least unnecessary labor. And I think that when we think about how does light move through this space and how can we have a deeply cinematic image and do that with the least unnecessary labor, that's a big win for me, because that's saving their creative labor. That's saving their energy so we have it for the next scene and the next scene and the next scene. So yeah, I really love light studies for that reason of almost all the places that I'm shooting into. Again, just try to maximize the cinema, minimize the unnecessary like flipping of a room or a lot of labor to get an image that is less good than the one we walked into the space with.
Makes total sense. It would be interesting to pivot a little bit to coverage, and I think that that's one element of your work that's incredibly inspiring to me. And I think both, of course, in All Dirt Roads, but I'm thinking specifically about Port Authority. And it was just really fascinating watching that film because, like, I lived in New York for like 11 years and I just had never seen the city shot in that way. And I felt that it just had this kind of suffocating feeling. The coverage specifically, just so suffocating, so raw, but yet super beautiful. And I think it felt like you and the director really achieved what so many struggle to do, which is to not like romanticize a location or romanticize a city like New York. And I was curious if that concept, I guess, of maybe not romanticizing it was ever something that you talked about or something you were thinking about trying to achieve. And if so, like, why was that approach the right fit for this particular story?
I think for that movie, the director Danielle Lesovitz and I talked about really early. She said a phrase to me that really stuck to me. And it was that she wanted this movie to feel like wind touching new skin. Like there's a deep discomfort to our character Finn falling in love. He's never felt these kinds. So it's like there is this raw aspect to it that she really wanted to capture. And she wanted to capture New York as this space that for someone who has not lived is exactly that, is suffocating, is intense, but also is addictive in its suffocation. And really just so much of the creative choices from that came from that phrase. And another big one on that she had said in The Color, Kath Raish at Company 3 colored the film. And we both had this really kind of amazing moment when Danielle, while we were creating the LUT together in prep, said that she wanted this image to feel like paper. She wanted it to feel really delicate like paper, and that the image could break and crack at any moment. And both of the Kath and I looked at each other and were like, whoa, okay, we could run with that. We can run with that. So a lot of the look kind of came from the combination of those two phrases of trying to create something that felt like new love, like young love, this kind of feeling that is in both parts, kind of feels like waterboarding, but also feels like you're flying for the first time, like just this explosive energy of complete wonderment to the emotions that you're feeling. And I think that was a lot of, again, kind of the idea that every single choice kind of came back into that. And for that movie, we shot on a set of Leicas, of modern Summicrons, where all of the coatings are stripped off. So there's a way where the image had this weird duality to it, where these were incredibly modern optics, but without modern coatings, the light would just ricochet all over inside of the barrel and give it this really kind of strange type of, like, the image was falling apart in some way, but then like clinically sharp in another way. And again, a lot of those conversations came back to trying to find those juxtapositions that Danielle had been talking about those feelings of discomfort, but also those feelings of elation that were in every moment of this movie. So yeah, there was a way in which for that, it was like just constantly trying to really maintain those juxtapositions, maintain that discomfort in the image.
one super quick follow-up to that was like, were those lenses selected prior to this note of the paper feeling? Like, did that inform the choice of uncoated glass and how you approach that?
I think that it came about the same time. So the kind of the two lens sets that we kept kind of going back and forth on were master anamorphics and these what they're called are classic crons. Were at the camera division had kind of first made these alterations and kind of first did this design, I think, with Dulcos. And so it was kind of between these two. And when Danielle said that, it was like, oh, it's got to be these. And yeah, I absolutely loved shooting on them. And again, it was the first time I think I had used that lens set. And there was something just so incredible about that juxtaposition where you're kind of getting these color renderings that are closer to maybe more vintage lenses that had less advanced coatings. But again, you still had that kind of like super sharp and clinically perfect, like a Summicron aesthetic, which again just really felt like it just connected with these themes. And Kath did just such an incredible job of interpreting that note of making the image very paper-like, where it wasn't that we necessarily wanted it to be low contrast, but to have this delicacy to it when you're seeing a very not delicate world and a character who is not delicate in any way, shape, or form. But again, was kind of trying to go after those juxtapositions.
Yeah, I love technology like that or gear like that that can have contradictions, that can be both modern and vintage at the same time, or be almost contradicting one choice. But, you know, I find that there's a very unique flavor it gives you.
I completely agree. I think that's something that this again might be going a little too far into the metaphysics of image making, but I love, and this is something ACs hate to hear, and is perhaps, irresponsible for me as a cinematographer. But I love tools that are kind of hard to work with. I think that my kind of idea is that they create tension. They create tension with the very process of making the movie, and that tension creates conflict. And I think all of drama is predicated essentially on conflict. Where I love, for the movie Selah and the Spades, we were drawn to these set of Kawa Promenars. And for the movie, those lenses, render a bit blue, but their flares are really warm. And so we love that aspect about them. But then we were like, well, we like that, but we don't want these lenses to flare for the movie. And we only want them to flare this really warm, really beautiful golden flare when there are moments of deep inhumanity or deep violence. And so it's kind of 90% of the movie, we weren't leaning into the aspect of those lenses that are most inherent in them. And 90% of the movie, it was flagging off these lenses so they wouldn't flare, which, because they were made in the 70s, it's a cell phone 2 rooms away would make these lenses flare. So there was a way in which it's again, maybe a more responsible cinematographer would be, oh yeah, well, let me just shoot with these other lenses, and then when we do that one scene, we'll do it with the Promenars. But to me, there was something that I loved about kind of to me, it forces you to have a rigid type way of working, which informs a visual language to me. I think it's the same sort of thought process of shooting Touch of Evil all on a 50 millimeter lens. Should you do that for every movie? Absolutely not. But I think working in a very restrained way creates its own language separate from the language that you are doing with the project. And I always find that interesting. I think that a set of choices that forces you into other choices, I think so much of art is made from our restrictions, not from infinite choices. And oftentimes I'll build in added restrictions to myself to just make the visual language that much more cohesive in a way. Cohesive because you're trapped into the same type of relationships between the camera, the lighting, and the environment again and again and again and again, which again, hopefully creates just a more of a cohesion among the images, which, I find fun. And I also think that it often adds something interesting and hard to kind of quantify.
Yeah. So Jomo, something we haven't covered at all in the show yet is second unit work. And I think that you in particular have done some very interesting second unit work with some incredible filmmakers and cinematographers. You did second unit on The Underground Railroad that was directed by Barry Jenkins and shot by James Laxton, ASC. You also worked second unit on the HBO series Random Acts of Flyness, which was created by Terrence Nance. And both of these shows are beautifully crafted and singular in their own way. I'm curious to know how you got involved in each of them. What were your duties as a second unit cinematographer? And then how did you integrate your own artistic voice into that of another DP's, given that you have such a unique way of approaching cinematography?
Yeah, how I got involved with each of those projects were kind of just relationships over a long period of time. Terrence Nance and the cinematographer on the show, Sean Peters, had just kind of been mentors and friends of mine for a very long time before that. So it felt like a very natural kind of ask to come on board. And similarly with Barry, we had known each other for a while. And yeah, they just invited me through to the show to come on, which in both cases was an incredible opportunity. I think second unit work is really fantastic. I think it, in a way that I think is helpful, it forces you to kind of have to suppress your own ego a little bit to be there in the service of another filmmaker, which I think as a cinematographer, we are always in the position, ideally, of suppressing our ego to allow the cinema to move through, to allow the director's vision to move through. But I think this is a very particular role where, I'll say before I became a cinematographer, one of my favorite jobs on set was to be the second AC. Like, I loved the aspect of trying to just be a shadow, of trying to think about what the DP needed before the DP needed it, and to always be in the right place for your first AC before the first AC noticed that they needed. And if I'm not a cinematographer, honestly, I love gotta be a second AC because I can just truly, fully be there to help the thing get made without ego. I think is just such an important lesson to either learn or an important lesson to constantly be relearning. So I think that as a second unit cinematographer, there's some aspect of that where you still have your control of a lot of creative decisions, but you are in the service of ideally shooting the way that James Laxton would shoot if James Laxton were on set right now, and shooting the way Sean Peters would shoot if Sean Peters was on set right now. And I think that that is a very humbling and fun headspace to kind of visit now and again. I think on both of those projects, I had kind of expected that would be the dynamic, but on both projects, they basically brought me in and Barry was like, I want you to just do whatever you want to do. Like, do what you think is interesting, because what I think you think is interesting, I think is interesting. So like basically don't be beholden to what the images that James and I are sending you, like kind of just want you to find things that you find interesting in this space. So it was kind of doing these scenes that were building out the world of the show in a lot of ways. And I think for them especially, it was just trying to find texture that was emotional and parts of scenes that were particularly emotional and evocative. So really they kind of just put me on the job of like, find evocative things within these setups and like kind of prioritize evocative stuff even above the plot of what's happening in this scene. And the same thing kind of happened on Random Acts, where Sean has known me for, a decade up until that point. So he and Terrence were just like, cool, here are the scripts, but like, go wild. Like, just do what you would normally do and approach it. And I was just like, well, yeah, but what's the cinematic language you guys are trying to do here? And they're like, no. And I think it helps that both of those shows have kind of a collage type aspect to them that are about kind of having these very different feelings put up together. And that is the project. So I think that was probably part of their direction in both of those cases. But both were remarkably fun in that way to kind of just have a bit of maybe my process and approach inside and inhabit itself within these worlds that they had kind of created in a much larger fashion than necessarily a narrative movie.
Wow, that's really interesting. Were you intimidated at all, like walking onto something like Underground Railroad?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was deeply intimidating. If anything, I think it was more intimidating because here I was hearing people I really admire being like, oh yeah, but we really like what you do, so just do what you do. And then it's like, wait, what do I do? What do you like about what I do? I feel like you do what I want to do better than I do it. So it was definitely intimidating and strange in that space. And also like, at that point, I hadn't really used many technocranes. And it was like, oh, I guess we're just on technocrane all day. And so, and like, needing to pretend like, oh yeah, this is totally normal for me. Me, they call me techno guy back home. But that was definitely intimidating. But, I think that that's so much of this industry or an aspect I have learned. At that point, I was not very good at it, and I'm probably still not very good at it. But what I try to embody these days is like, I don't know every piece of gear. That's why you hire people who do know the gear. And our job is to really be thoughtful in why we need the gear. And then to tell a technician who is the best technician you can possibly get, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I'm emotionally trying to do. How would you do that? And then to kind of curate their answer, where I think at the time I was so afraid of seeming like I wasn't an expert in every aspect of the craft. And I think that, I've just seen the people I respect the most as cinematographers have been the ones that are the quickest and easiest to ask a question because they don't know how to do something, or asking a technician, well, how would you best do this? Like, what do you think my approach should be to this, where it's kind of like letting their ego go because at some very real level, they know the thing that's important. I think this happens oftentimes with directors as well, is that directors think they need to know all the answers. So, like, oh yeah, I want this on a 35, because I like the compression and I don't like contrast. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. All the things you just said is crazy. But where it's like, you don't need to know that. I'm not expecting that as a cinematographer. Actually, I would prefer that what I want you to know is the emotion. What I want you to know is what you want to get out of the actor. What I want you to know is you can recognize cinema when you're seeing it, and you have a wider vision of how these things are going to slot together. And then from there, just ask me what you don't know. And if I don't know it, we'll ask someone together that could know it better. I think that that's kind of where I try to get when I feel intimidated within cinematography, which happens often. And I think is natural, and it should happen. I'd say the moment that you're never intimidated or you're never scared about any aspect of the work you're doing, I would say that's the death of a career. That's the death of wonderment. That's something that I just deeply admire about someone like Roger Deakins, is that Deakins still feels wonderment on his 30th project. He still talks about feeling scared before the first shot of after being nominated multiple times for the Oscar, he's still scared about day one. I actually think that's the mark of someone with a very beautiful framework and a beautiful approach, that at their age, they can still have butterflies. They can still not know certain equipment. I think that that's exciting. That means that you've lived, I'd say a pretty artistically adventurous life.
Brilliant. That show is so gut-wrenching and beautiful, the Underground Railroad. So just feeling incredibly inspired by this conversation, and so grateful to have you on. And I think that, as we start to kind of wind down, I wanted to ask a question about something that has kind of been inspiring me lately, just this sort of concept that film is a language, and project to project, there's a language, shot to shot, there's a language. And then over time, the language of film evolves and shifts and is dynamic. And yourself, as someone who is a lover of film and film history, and I've heard you say that you were incredibly inspired by films of the 80s and the language of those films. I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about how film functions as a language, and your interest in contributing to that language, and how it changes and evolves over time.
Absolutely. I think that cinema is so specific because it matches, in a lot of ways, the framework of how we dream. Like no other art necessarily does it the way cinema does it, where in our dreams we can jump space and we can jump time, and also operates on a deeply kind of subconscious textual logic. So in that way, there's something where cinema allows us to actually share dreams with each other. That's incredible. And I think within that, it's thinking that cinema is only a little bit more than 100 years old. Cinema is it is beyond its infancy. Like it is truly still primordial is what we're talking about in terms of where cinema is at and what cinema is capable of doing. And I just think that cinema could be capable of so much. It's so powerful to think that a medium where we can share dreams, where we can share ideally some of the very feelings to be inside of our own bodies. And when I think about that, I think about film language. When I think about that, I think about Eisenstein, from even the invention of the montage. Like there's just so much technology, so much emotional technology and within cinema that I think we've only begun to scratch the surface on, and even thinking about this like most recently, where like the predominance of the shot of the world starting upside down and slowly pushing in and the world righting itself. I'm thinking about that scene in Black Panther when Rachel Morrison did it when Michael B. Jordan first sits on the throne, and then you're seeing that shot kind of pop up a lot more now. And it's like, that shot existed before, but the fact that now this motion connects to a feeling. Midsommar, when they did that shot of when she enters the bathroom and then gets on the plane, where it's like, oh, the world is being turned upside down. Like that is so exciting to me when cinema finds new language, new words, because ultimately what that means to me is that cinema has found a new way to say an emotion. I think that the form in art becomes really interesting when synonyms cease being synonyms. When actually two words that are about the same meaning actually have a difference to them. And I think right now in this form, we're so early on. Like, I don't think we're there yet. So I've spent my life loving film. I told my parents at like age 7, I wanted to be a filmmaker, like an insane person. And so I think that the manifestation of that love from me is that I love to study cinematic language. And my deepest hope over the course of a lifetime working in this space would be to even just add one word, add one phrase to this art form. To me would be a life truly worth living, because it's those turns of phrases that, like, I'm thinking of another one, Wong Kar-wai and Chungking, when Tony Leung is standing there and all of the characters are moving fast around him and he's sitting there. It's like, that's so emotional. And I feel like a lot of people know that feeling of feeling like they're moving slowly while the world is moving quickly around them. That's so profound to me, because like in the same way that I love slang. I love slang because you can come up with a word that perfectly describes a feeling. That's incredible. And to me, why I love slang is it is always developing. It is always striving to have new ways of being that much more articulate about the human experience. So when I think about visual language in film, I'm thinking about us getting more articulate with being able to describe the emotional lives that we all lead, deeply isolated from one another, but that we share. So I think that that's also kind of goes back to the question of what directors do I work with, how do I choose projects? I think I choose projects with primarily deeply artorist style directors, because those are usually the people and the projects that are trying to express something that they might not have seen expressed exactly like they experienced it. And when they're so after getting that feeling across, I feel like the conversations in the process often push me to try to think about new ways with the image that we can try to express, again, the specificity of maybe there might be a synonym that's out there, but how do we get even deeper on the way that this is slightly different than another feeling? And I'm not saying I always do it. I think I mostly don't do it. But I think that it is the thing that excites me the most about film, the thing that excites me the most about cinema, is every time getting up at bat, trying to swing to find a more specific emotion in every shot.
I think most of our guests excite me about cinematography, but you're the one guest that's made me want to go watch a movie.
I love that.
That's what I want to do right now.
Movies are awesome. As it turns out, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, same. So thank you. I have one more question. So I like that you brought up Chase Irvin a few times in this conversation. Admittedly, I had coffee with him earlier this year, and I walked away feeling so inspired. I was hanging on every word that he said. He is someone who has developed his own process of shooting things. I would say, like, philosophically and technologically, everything is very bespoke to what and how he wants to articulate himself through cinematography. Now, I think what's really interesting is that cinematographers, I would say, like, in our position, who have done some work, young cinematographers and maybe even older cinematographers, I think can always be at risk of thinking that the way one person does something is the way that you should do it. And I would love to hear from you how it is that maybe more up-and-coming cinematographers, how you can advise them to look for their own intuitive voice. Because personally, I feel like my intuitive voice came a little bit later, and I wish it came earlier. Now, when you talked about turning down projects and that also being a reflection of yourself, again, personally, I feel like there's some things I shot earlier in my career that were not reflections of me. So the question really is, how can people who are still developing their voice not listen to this interview and be like, oh, Jomo is so good and I'm going to do everything Jomo does? Like, how do you inspire them to take what you're saying and then kind of like rework that into what works for them?
Absolutely. I think it's funny you mentioned that. Benoit just posted this piece to Instagram of a quote from Deleuze saying that intuition is not a feeling, is not an inspiration, but a fully developed method, which I really love, because to me that says that intuition isn't something that the gods pass through you, but is actually the forming of a process that is bespoke and specifically you, completely you, and the ways that you like to work. That I think that is, again, as we're talking about film language, the beauty of cinematography to me is that it's impossible for me to shoot like Chase. It's impossible for Chase to shoot like me. It's impossible for someone else to shoot like me. And I'm not saying that that means that like we'll never catch up with one another, but it's to say that what's beautiful about what we do is how specific it is. In the same way that I think what's beautiful about an auteur or a director is because there's never been another person like them. There will never be another person like them ever again. They are the first and the last of their name. Like, that actually is really, really powerful and really interesting. And something that the director Khalil Joseph once said to me, he was like, I want you to shoot in a way that feels funky to you, because if it feels funky to you, it's going to feel funky to me. And I would say that I would tell younger cinematographers coming up, but I tell myself that every day. I don't think that I'll ever get to a place of mastering this craft or fully understanding what we do. I have a lot of ideas about it, but those ideas shift and change daily, monthly, and can change, as you were saying, with a single conversation with someone. So really, I think it is about us spending our time getting to know ourselves as people, as humans, as people in the world, as artists, and then finding ways of how can I articulate myself even more? Because it's actually about the specificity of you, that Christopher Doyle can't shoot the way Emmanuel Lubezki shoots and vice versa. But it's actually not that there is one dominant cinematographer. It's that I love that we live in a world where we have Emmanuel Lubezki, we have Christopher Doyle, we have Ellen Kurz. Like, that is actually an exciting world. And I think that it's not about becoming our heroes. The goal I always try to tell myself is that I want to be the type of cinematographer that my heroes would love. That's not saying that they want to see themselves, but it's to say that I want to be someone that the people I respect see me doing something very different and are like, that's cool. Because that's kind of how I feel, is that I love seeing the work of other people at whatever level, whether, you know, they're at a level above me or below me. Like, I just want to be inspired. I just want to see images that I haven't thought of before. I want to see visual language continue to grow. And visual language grows when people are more specific about the artists that they are, and they're less afraid of taking the risk of being themselves. I think that we do a great disservice to ourselves as an industry when we try to chase a singular look, when we try to chase a singular cinematographer. Like, that's not, the goal isn't to, you know, this isn't Highlander rules where there can only be one. Like, actually, there must be many, because without many, this field won't have biodiversity and it will fundamentally die. So actually, what we need is people to be more specifically themselves in every aspect of how they make images. Like, that's the world I want to see. And I think that that's some of the most exciting people in each of their times are people who take the risk of being themselves in a world where they see the success of being someone else. But ultimately, I think that that's where genius lies. It lies right along the line of abject stupidity. So, like, you know, I would say that I want to shoot every job like I'm going to be fired, and cinema will get together and be like, we can't have this guy work here anymore. He's crazy. So, like, ideally for me, it's like, shoot every shot as if it could be fundamentally your last. And if it's going to be my last, well, I'm going to be as front-footedly loud about my goals as possible. And I think that that leads to a place of ideally, hopefully, exciting work, or at least that's a lot of the work that I look back on and I get excited about. When everyone is saying you need to shoot a thick negative and Harris Savidi is saying, do you? Like, that is exciting. That is exciting to me. When people say that and Gordon says, like, nope, I'm shooting as thin as heavenly possible, is I genuinely am like, I'm going to do top lighting. Everyone says it's ugly, but I think it's evocative. Is like, I think those are the places that we find these big kind of moves within our field aren't Gordon perfecting lighting, but it's actually Gordon Willis saying, you know what? This is the type of lighting I observe in my life. This is the lighting that feels real and evocative to me, specifically me. And those are the kind of moves that change our art form, our people, again, finding what is evocative to them and doing that, which is why I just always like to say for myself, and that so much of cinematography ideally is observational. Honestly, I think 90% of this job is listening. Listening to a director, listening to the story, listening to the script, listening to the way the light moves through space, and listening to yourself. So I think that the better we can get of just observing life, looking at life and seeing what do we think is evocative to us, not what is the most evocative, what is evocative to us, to you as a cinematographer, and really taking note of when that happens. Take note of what's the quality of the light when, like, I'll always remember the quality of the light when I proposed to my wife. I'll always remember that. And that has a significance to me. It's not pretty light. It's pretty ugly, but the light had a quality to it that's really special to me. So I take note of that. I put it away in my back pocket. And I think it's about all of us individually as artists taking note in our real lives outside of set, what looks and feels evocative to us, and then taking those things, bringing them on set is the stuff that I think will make any artist a great artist.
Wow. This has just been such an amazing experience. And I think I got chills multiple times in this conversation, and just incredibly grateful to have had you on, and incredibly grateful for your wisdom and your intellect and your sort of heartfelt
humanistic approach to everything. And it's been truly inspiring to watch the work and to get to talk to you today. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you both so much. And thank you so much for so many insightful questions that really pushed me to try to articulate some of these things I maybe feel, but don't often put into words. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jomo.
This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Ava Benjamin Shore, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave and edited by Corey Abel. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the Salon community for supporting our efforts with this show. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Able Cine for their continued support. If you're unfamiliar with their offerings, Able Cine provides services such as equipment rentals, sales, maintenance, training, and much more. Additionally, they host complimentary events at their various locations. For more details, please visit ablecine.com. If you enjoyed listening to the show, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.